thank you for inviting us to Wales. I'm delighted and honoured to introduce Professor David Nutt, who's giving today's President's Lecture. Now, that doesn't mean, there was a bit of confusion last night that people thought that you were going to be the next President. I didn't think you were silly enough to... Yeah.
No.
That was what I thought you'd say. So the President's Lecture is a lecture commissioned by the President, and this is the first time ever that one has been delivered in Wales, so really pleased to welcome you. Now, this is David's biography. Two sides of A4. So I looked at it and I thought, well, I'll get that down to the kind of really important essential bits. There was nothing that I could cut out of it. Every word in here is something amazing. So, and then I thought, should I do a PowerPoint presentation of his biography? But I thought probably not.
Great.
So he's done a huge number of amazing things. He summed it up for me. He's spent over 40 years practicing and researching psychiatry, and also being involved in national and international organisations, developing new treatments and working on policies. And this reflects some key learnings from the different elements of his career. So over to you, David.
Thank you. Well, it's really great for you to indulge me in this little topic of the title of mine, 40 Years of Psychiatry, and also to invite me back to Wales. Now, the last time I spoke at a Welsh psychiatry meeting, it was in St David's, probably, who was there, 30 years ago? Yeah, you were there, right? You remember it. I was there, wasn't I? I don't know. They gave me a tie. Well, I couldn't find it. I was desperately trying to find a tie last night, but my life's a bit chaotic, so I haven't got your tie. But none of you got ties either. There's probably no. You don't even sell the tie anymore, do you? No, okay. Because it's or the scarf, by the way. I think it had dragons on it. So it's nice to be back, because I don't live very far away. Just across the Severn Estuary. But thank you for indulging me in this look at retrospective. So I gave up clinical practice 2 years ago. I'm 67 now, maybe it's 3 years ago, and eventually the NHS in London was going to wore me down, and when they told me they were going to move my clinic from Chelsea and Westminster to Hounslow, I thought, that's giving me a message, isn't it? Those of you who don't know London won't understand, but anyway, those of you do. So I decided to stop doing clinical work and focus on research and teaching, which means now I have time to come and give lectures on Fridays to people like you who are interested. So I'm going to look back over 40 years and reflect on what we've learned, what I've learned, how it's affected what we might learn in the future. I'm going to start with this man. So Thomas Sachs, 1971, his book, The Myth of Mental Illness. I am an undergraduate at university. I've gone to university to study psychiatry, despite the best efforts of my tutors to dissuade me. But I decided I stuck by my guns, and then along came this man telling me it's all a myth. The nice thing about Thomas, he's very egalitarian. He hates psychiatrists, he hates psychotherapists, he hates anything to do with the brain. And what's remarkable is that he's still there. I mean, the premise of those books is still with us, and we're fighting these battles on a kind of weekly basis with their concepts being resurrected by people like Gutschke and Kirsch, etc. over the years. So it's always there. So it's one of the burdens that we in psychiatry have to carry. I like to say to my trainees and students that as you get older, you get more interested in history because you're becoming part of it. And I like this quote from Santayana: "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." Sadly, in some areas of medicine, particularly in drug abuse, drug addiction, well, not only can't we remember the past, we actively repress the past, so we never learn. But it's an important message there. I can. Oh, is there a microphone?
Maybe.
Is there a microphone?
Oh, yes.
Okay, sorry about that. Yes, it's quite a damp. Shall I start again? You can read it. Can you see the screen? You can come to the front if you like. There's spaces here. This is where I started psychiatry. This is the old St Olave's Hospital in London. There was my room, and what was interesting about that, and what's interesting about me, I guess those of you who vaguely know me think of me as a psychopharmacologist and a brain imager, but I started out being extremely keen on social psychiatry. I did my elective, not in Africa, but here. This is a community psychiatric hospital down in East London. And of course, you can work out what it used to be before it was a psychiatric hospital. It was a workhouse. Behind there was a load of was a previously accommodation, then turned out to be the ward. So there I was. But I was always interested in research, and I started working with this guy Barnes. Some of you might have heard of Tom Barnes. And we were very interested in those days in concept of tardive dyskinesia, trying to work out why it happened. And my first research was going through piles of notes, looking at every prescription that patients were given, writing them down and turning them into chlorpromazine equivalents, so you could actually have some kind of structured assessment of exposure to antipsychotics. And I wrote my first prescription in 1974 because in those days, even though I wasn't trained, locums, I did a locum for 6 weeks as a psychiatrist, a medical student, and I was allowed to prescribe. And I reckon my first prescription was probably stelazine, trifluperazine. Any of you heard of that? Is it still available? I'm not sure. Can't remember. Anyway, that was the drug my consultant liked, and it was prescribed. And my last prescription, June 2014, I remember this one vividly. My last prescription, Chelsea in Westminster, 4:30 on a Tuesday afternoon, dexamphetamine and olanzapine for a patient with ADHD who also had some psychosis. And what's obvious about that is that in 40 years nothing has changed. We're still prescribing drugs which work in the same way. The difference between olanzapine and stelazine is just how much weight they put on. But in terms of their functionality, they're pretty much the same drug. So in 40 years, absolutely nothing's changed. And dexamphetamine predates even my birth. That's been around for nearly 100 years as a medicine. And I don't know how to. I try to stop this noise, but I can't. And the point is, these drugs all work on dopamine. And in many ways, dopamine has been the sort of paradigm case for psychiatry, largely, of course, because the patients who give us the biggest challenges are people who've got dysregulation of the dopamine system in psychosis. And this is, there's a little pun in the title, for those of you who know a little bit about addiction. But anyway, I see dopamine has been the sort of paradigm case for how we think about drugs in psychiatry. Of course, the origins of dopamine are in the substantia nigra, in the brainstem, and dopamine, of course, is a hugely influential transmitter. The first neurotransmitter associated with a brain disorder. The discovery that in Parkinson's disease, this normal substantia nigra, the black area, disappears as the dopamine neurons die. So this was the first chemical understanding of a neurological disorder. And the amazing thing was, you gave L-Dopa, put the dopamine back, people got better. And it works, and it still works today, still being used as the first-line treatment today. And then, of course, we discovered about the same time as this deficiency was being discovered in the 1950s, that stimulants release dopamine, antipsychotics block dopamine, and these effects are predictable and reliable. Absolutely. And you do it all day, you block people's dopamine and people get better, and then they go out and they smoke a bit of crack and they get worse because they release a bit of dopamine. So it's utterly right. It's like it's almost a linear relationship between dopamine and psychosis. But sadly, it's not necessarily the case for other neurotransmitters, and I think part of the problem we have is that we've wanted it to be simple, but it isn't. And in my lifetime, I've done a huge amount of science. You forgot to say I had published over 500 papers. I've given more different drugs to human beings than anyone else alive, different classes of drugs. And I haven't really discovered anything. All the discoveries, all the breakthroughs in psychiatry have all come through serendipity. I mean, all current classes of drugs, except heroin addiction, where we give buprenorphine or methadone, they've all been discovered by serendipity. Antidepressants. There were MAOIs being developed for tuberculosis. The first antidepressant, imipramine, was a derivative of chlorpromazine. And it was being tested in people with schizophrenia. And it didn't treat their psychosis, but it did improve their mood. Antipsychotics, well, chlorpromazine, of course, was the derivative of promazine, an antihistamine. They put a chlorine atom on to make it more lipophilic, so it got in the brain better, it was more potent. And it was a better sedative, but it was also an antipsychotic. It's interesting to reflect that these two discoveries were made on cohorts of less than 15 people. So the transformation in psychiatry came from a couple of clinicians who knew what they were doing, who gave a new drug to patients with a defined disorder and discovered they worked. Actually, I'm not sure you could discover these drugs today the way we are forced to do trials. I kind of feel that they would probably fail in the way into the current trials, and we probably wouldn't have any drugs if we... And that may be why we don't have any new drugs, because we're actually not doing the studies right. That's another story. Benzos were sedatives. Valproate was a solvent, which was essentially used to dissolve benzos, and people realised it actually had effects by itself. Gabalin, pregabalin, gabapentin, these were GABA analogues, it weren't. And of course they actually are quite effective anticonvulsants, and they morphed into analgesics and then into anxiety-reducing drugs. These were anticonvulsants before they became into psychiatry. And acamprosate was developed as a taurine analogue, as a kind of food supplement, but it turned out not to be that, but it was somewhat useful in helping people restrain themselves from drinking. So they're all accidental discoveries. And I think it's quite likely that the future of psychiatry will also be with accidental discoveries. And that's the process of serendipity. But serendipity only happens if you are prepared to be serendipitous and to think about what's happening and to consider using it in other drugs for other indications. So, for instance, the bipolar disorder of valproate came from epilepsy. Agomelatine, the last but one new antidepressant, was developed as a melatonin analog for sleep. Actually surprisingly ineffective, certainly no better than melatonin, but it did have a signal for depression in animals and was shown to work in humans. And I've already mentioned pregabalin. But the problem with these drugs, we have no idea how they work. We don't really know how agomelatine works. It's a weird combination of melatonin agonists and 5-HT2C antagonists. We don't quite know whether that's all it is. So we don't know. We don't really know how to innovate from serendipity. And here are the challenges. Because it's so difficult, most companies have pulled out. There was almost no pharmaceutical research left in the field of psychiatry. The neuroscience models we have in animals, they're fantastically predictive for benzodiazepines. They're very predictive for dopamine, and they're not really predictive for much else. It takes 13 years to get a psychiatric drug to market. It takes 5 years to get a cancer drug to market. The patent life, the copyright life, is the same for both. So is it surprising investors prefer anti-cancer drugs to psychiatry drugs? No. Our regulatory system is biased against the challenge of psychiatry. We've got phenomenal oppressive health technology. It's only in psychiatry that you have to do studies for a minimum of 6 months up to a year in order to show that drugs work. In epilepsy, you don't have to do it at all. You just get a new drug, you throw it onto the other drugs, and if it works, then you've got a drug. But in psychiatry, the regulators have set enormously more complex hurdles for us. And the bottom line is, in the last decade, we've got 2 antidepressants, agomelatine and vortioxetine, 1 anxiolytic pregabalin, 2 antipsychotics, acenapine, which is pretty much dead now, and lorazepam, which is hardly different from what we had, the drug we had, haloperidol, 40 years ago. So there's very, very little innovation. This is the only innovative drug, vortioxetine, and it's probably the last antidepressant you'll ever see. Probably the last novel antidepressant. So let's see what we've learned in these disorders over the last 40 years and how can it help us go forward. Well, we have learned one very important thing. This graph, hopefully you've all seen. It's probably the most important graph in psychopharmacology. And it shows that there is a strong relationship between the daily dose of a drug for psychosis and the affinity. This is low affinity, this is micromolar affinity, this is nanomolar affinity. Drugs with low affinity, like chlorpromazine, you give a gram a day or so, and drugs with high affinity, like pimozide, you give perhaps 2 to 3 milligrams a day. The strong relationship only relates to the dopamine system. It doesn't relate to the serotonin system or the noradrenaline system, or in this case, in his study, the cholinergic system. So this proves that the drugs we used bind to the dopamine receptor, and they're all blockers, of course. What we've seen in the last 40 years is the evolution of new dopamine blocking agents from the original chlorpromazine. And this breakthrough was made not by the this paper is 1974. These drugs were made before 1974, and they were made on animal models, because the real breakthrough came in 1957 when Arvid Carlsson worked out that chlorpromazine prevented the hyperactivity produced by giving rats L-DOPA and a monoamine oxidase inhibitor. They'd run around like crazy, and then if you gave them chlorpromazine, they didn't run around like crazy, and he said chlorpromazine blocks dopamine receptors. Well, that was important, but what was more important was you had an assay, because we didn't know about the dopamine receptors, but we knew that if you could block the animals running, you could maybe have an antipsychotic. So these drugs were all made from animal models of hyperactivity. And it turns out that they were all rather different. These 5 drugs were all different from chlorpromazine because they were relatively clean for the dopamine receptor, unlike chlorpromazine, which had multiple actions beyond the dopamine receptor. And when I started in psychiatry back in the 74, 75, I remember having these arguments with my consultants, not the one who allowed me to prescribe trifluperazine, but the next one, who I would want to prescribe haloperidol, and he'd say, no, I've been prescribing chlorpromazine for 15 years, it's good enough for me, it's good enough for you. And I'd say, yeah, but look, you prescribe chlorpromazine, but you've got to give them sun cream, you've got to give them hats, they're going to end up having problems with their lenses, they're going to end up with constipated, dry mouth, hypotensive. Do you really want to poison them with chlorpromazine when you could give them these nice clean drugs? Say, yeah, but it works, Anyway, of course, we won the battle, because the youth always, thank God, wins. Otherwise, we wouldn't have any junior doctors at all. So we won the battle. We started using these drugs, and of course, we discovered that they had a lot more extrapyramidal side effects than chlorpromazine. So it was paradoxical. Why was that? And of course, the reason was that chlorpromazine turns out to have its own antidote built in. So we were giving, when you use these drugs, you have to give drugs like procitridine to deal with the dopamine blockade, whereas chlorpromazine's got it built into the molecule. But the good thing was that you still have the rats, so you could go back to the rats and do experiments where you could find drugs which actually stop rats running to L-DOPA, but didn't cause them to go stiff, because if you give a rat haloperidol, it was one of my very first experiments in my PhD. You give rats haloperidol, and they 5 hours. And so you can go back, you can find a drug that stops them running but doesn't make them stiff. And, sorry, I'll come to that in a second, I got carried away. But what other development are relating to these drugs I want to show on the next slide, because the advent of binding technology allowed us then to study binding in the human brain. And we do have very good tools to study dopamine in the human brain, partly because of the role in schizophrenia, partly because of the role in addiction. So here you see the labeling of dopamine receptors in the human brain using a raclopride, a dopamine antagonist. And you see most of the dopamine receptors are in the basal ganglia, the caudate putamen here. And there's a few in the thalamus and a few in the temporal lobes, but the high density is here. And following a lowish dose of haloperidol, most of those receptors are blocked by the haloperidol. So this was the first proof that the binding in the test tube does translate to the binding in the human. Now that particular study done by Kapur in Toronto and replicated by Faraday in Stockholm told us something really important. It told us there was a dose relationship between the dose of the antipsychotic and the occupation of receptors, which translated very immediately into clinical practice. So when you're dosing with a drug which blocks dopamine receptors, you've got to get up to about 65% occupation to get a clinical effect. But if you carry on dosing, when you get to over 80% occupation, you get extrapyramidal side effects. And for the pure dopamine blocking drugs, it's quite difficult to find a dose which keeps you in this narrow therapeutic window. Now this particular approach actually changed the way we practice psychiatry, because until we started having these PET data, it was quite typical. We would prescribe 10 milligrams of haloperidol, TDS, That was just what we did, you know, that's how you gave haloperidol. Didn't kill anyone, and it certainly slowed them down a lot. And then we discovered that actually 10 milligrams of haloperidol was way over here, way too much. You're occupying almost all the receptors with 6 milligrams. So that changed the practice of psychiatry. Science changed it. We now don't prescribe huge doses of haloperidol. We prescribe doses which are hopefully in this range of therapeutic benefit and below the range of causing EPS. And then the next thing that happened was that companies went away and found drugs which didn't make rats stiff but stopped locomotor activity. And these drugs were produced: clozapine, olanzapine, quetiapine, risperidone, exenapine, niraparib, etc. And when these drugs came out, we knew we could do pharmacology then. So we discovered that these drugs had what we called a very dirty pharmacology, because they bound to lots of other receptors, not just the dopamine receptor. And we called them very dirty drugs. But actually the companies are very clever. They decided to redefine dirty as rich. These drugs have a rich pharmacology, and they do. They have a rich pharmacology. And actually that pharmacology is quite helpful, because this pharmacology, particularly the 5-HT2 blockade and the muscarinic blockade, minimize or reduce the side effects in terms of extrapyramidal side effects. And this may even add to the antipsychotic effect. Problem is, these effects do have quite deleterious impact on, particularly on physiology and metabolism. And then also developed the partial agonist, the concept of the partial agonist aripiprazole, a very different construct, but one which, in cases of high levels of dopamine, which is what we know to be the case in disorders like schizophrenia, then it works as an antagonist. In fact, now based on the pharmacology of these different classes of drug, we can really say there are three classes of antipsychotics. There are the partial agonists, currently in the UK, only aripiprazole, but there are other ones available in other parts of the world, and they may or may not come here in your lifetime. Aripiprazole is pretty much a pure dopamine blocker. What I've done on this graph is I've scaled everything so that the dopamine affinity is 1. Because in clinical practice, you've got to give enough of these drugs to block the dopamine system. So what's important is to know what else you're blocking when you block the dopamine system. Without aripiprazole, you're doing very, very little else. Now, haloperidol, you're doing very little else. Amisulpride, you're doing nothing else. Paliperidone, risperidone, you're blocking the dopamine system, but you're also blocking at higher amounts the 5-HT2 receptor system, which may have some antipsychotic activity too. So these are the dopamine blocking drugs, this is the dopamine partial agonist. And over here you have the other drugs. And obviously I put a dotted line around clozapine because it's still got something extra than the others. But quetiapine, olanzapine, clozapine, by the time you block the dopamine receptor, you've blocked all the muscarinic receptors, all the 5-HT2 receptors, all the histamine receptors, and in these two cases, all the alpha-1 receptors. And with a drug like olanzapine, it's impossible to give a dose of olanzapine that doesn't block every histamine receptor in your patient's brain. Now that's quite good if you want them to sleep, but it's not good if you don't want them to eat, because blocking histamine receptors increases appetite. So some of the metabolic syndrome is driven by this high level of histamine blockade here. And the message is very straightforward. If you are wanting to change a drug for lack of efficacy, or if you're wanting to add in a second drug to improve outcome, or to change side effects, such as adding aripiprazole to reduce prolactin, you should do it across these three classes. Because there's no point in adding two drugs that have essentially the same kind of pharmacology. So knowing that at least gives you some kind of utility in terms of decision making. But there's one other thing I want to talk about with schizophrenia, which is a study that almost none of you ever heard of. It's never talked about, but it's probably the most important study ever done in schizophrenia, in terms of the biology of schizophrenia. And this is a study done by Mark Laruelle, nearly 20 years old now. Remarkable study. The reason it's not been replicated, of course it's so difficult to do, he took people who were schizophrenic, were psychotic, brought them in to the wards in Columbia University, they're drug-free, and then he put them in a scanner to measure dopamine receptors and the release of dopamine. And then he gave them amphetamine in the scanner, which is not the easiest thing to get through in ethics when someone's psychotic, but he did. And he measured the amount of dopamine release in the brains of people who were acutely psychotic. And he compared them with the amount released in people who weren't psychotic, normal healthy controls. And you do that by looking at the displacement of ractopamine produced by the amphetamine. And he discovered that there was a much wider impact of the amphetamine in schizophrenia than in the healthy controls. In fact, there was a group of people with schizophrenia who had a massively elevated release of dopamine, and another group that had normal release. And I think these accord with what we would typically think of as the old Crow type 1, positive symptoms, of type 2, negative symptoms. Now, that was interesting. It was the first proof that in schizophrenia there is an excessive release of dopamine. It explains why so many people do go worse when they take drugs like crack or crystal or amphetamines or cocaine. But it also showed something else. So here is the change in positive symptoms during that challenge test with amphetamine and the amount of dopamine being released. And by and large, the more dopamine released, up is more dopamine released, the greater the release of dopamine, the worse people were, the more psychotic they became. But not everyone got worse. And this guy here was very interesting. He got better. He got an 8-point reduction in his PANSS scale, despite having nearly a 30% increase in dopamine. Now that tells me one thing. It tells me that this patient is different from these patients. These patients here did very well after the scan when he put them on dopamine blockers, because they've got a disorder where they have too much dopamine. This guy didn't do very well, because he has a dopamine deficiency schizophrenia. And the problem of all the research in schizophrenia since that time is that we do not stratify. Oops. And if we look at this population here, half of them have too much and half have normal. It is kind of almost remarkable that dopamine blockers work, because they've only got 50% of the population to work on, but they do. But it's not surprising that other new treatments don't work, because if they don't work on dopamine, you've only got these patients they could work on. And maybe within there are several different subgroups. And I don't think we will discover new treatments for schizophrenia until we start refining our analysis. I think we need to stratify by dopamine release. We know how to deal with these people to help them. We need to find these, and we need to find whether some of them will need dopamine and some of them won't. Now, almost one of the very first talks I heard when I was an SHO in psychiatry back in the 70s was a guy called George Ashcroft. He was head of the, he was professor at Aberdeen. He came from the MRC Brain Metabolism Unit in Edinburgh, and he said the way we should be treating schizophrenia is we should be blocking the mesolimbic system, and then we should be giving them all amphetamine to turn on their prefrontal cortex. And he was right, probably, because there will definitely be some people who will benefit from having dopamine in their prefrontal cortex. And that was the justification for me in my that last prescription. I was doing exactly that. I was taking someone who needed dopamine in his prefrontal cortex because he had ADHD, but needed dopamine blocked in his mesolimbic system because he had paranoia. I was doing it. I don't know how many other people are doing it, probably not many of you. But if we don't do it systematically and routinely, we're missing a real opportunity to move forward. And I've given this talk and shown this picture the last couple of years in various places around the world, and quite often old psychiatrists come up to me and say, you know, back in the 50s and 60s, we used to give amphetamines to people with schizophrenia, and some of them did better, but we're not allowed to do that anymore. And the reason we're not allowed to do that anymore is because we kind of lost sight of the fact that they might benefit. Okay, what about depression? What do we learn about depression? We've learned quite a few things. We've learned, interestingly, that depression is enduring. When I started in psychiatry, depression was like pneumonia. You had it, you got over it. We now know that's not true. And just to emphasise the point I made about safety, the UK was one of the last countries in the world to really, of the Western sort of civilised world, to modern, whatever you'd call world, rich world, to endorse the use of SSRIs. And the reason we did that is complicated and largely for economic reasons. But, and it was also because some people tried to scare us from using them. But what you see here, this is a decade of deaths from tricyclics and from SSRIs. And we know that although that the safety margin of the new drugs is so amazing, So here you see, in the decade when most other countries eliminated the use of tricyclics, we had nearly 3,000 deaths because we didn't eliminate them because we didn't want to, or we just couldn't be bothered, or I don't know. It's one of the great failings of modern medicine that we carried on using these drugs. Still, it's only I think 2 years ago that amitriptyline ceased to being the leading cause of death by suicide. I think paracetamol has now overtaken it. We've also changed our view of depression from being pneumonia-like to chronic relapsing illness like epilepsy. Part of the reason are studies like this by Jean Paykel, really influential studies showing that if you take people who are not fully recovered from depression, and of course 50% of people we treat aren't, and then you randomise them to placebo, the ones who aren't fully recovered have a relapse rate of about 80% in about 6 months, whereas the ones that are fully recovered don't. So the idea that you could stop antidepressants in people who are still suffering some symptoms of depression is actually completely fallacious. And I think the issue now is not actually how long do you treat with antidepressants, it's when is it safe to stop. Exactly the same decision-making process as you would make with someone like with epilepsy who's getting an antiepileptic. And we also get told that our drugs aren't very good, antidepressants aren't very good. Well, the number needed to lift depression is not brilliant, it's 6 to 7. It's about the mean for most medical treatments in medicine. The number needed to prevent relapse is 3 over 36. So if you treat someone for 3 years who's going to have a relapse, the number needed to prevent a relapse is 3. Now, statin to prevent a relapse of heart attack is about 20. This is one of the strongest, smallest NNTs in medicine. Antidepressants do work, and they're particularly powerful at preventing relapse. So this is the point I'm making. The question now is not how long to treat, but when's it safe to stop? And then another paradigm shift. This is where brain science really has done something completely unexpected. It's turned on its head, the concept of depression. So when I was training, Paykel was the man who was the doyen of depression research, and the concept that I was brought up on was that depression is caused by exit events. You lose your job, you lose your wife, you lose your leg. In Felix Post's research, you get depressed, you've lost something. Depression's loss. And we all thought, well, depression's because you lose positive effects in the brain. Your positive affect, it goes. But then Helen Mayberg came along and started studying the brain in depressed people. And she discovered that actually in the brain of depressed people, there's an area of the brain which is overactive. And that's called CG25. Now at the time you could argue, well, overactivity could be a defense reaction. That could be treating the depression. Maybe that's how you get better. But modern neurosurgery allowed her to persuade her neurosurgeons to test that hypothesis. Because so many people have had deep brain stimulation for Parkinson's disease. Over 100,000 people have got implanted electrodes in the subthalamic nucleus to treat Parkinson's disease. She asked the surgeons, could she, and the way it works in Parkinson's is to switch off the subthalamic nucleus, which is overactive in Parkinson's disease. So she said, well, do you think you could switch off this region CG25 and let's find out whether it is driving depression or helping you recover from depression? And they did. They did deep brain stimulation in 8 people, switched off CG25, and they got better. And they carried on stimulating, and they stayed better. And that was powerful evidence that CG25 is driving depression, not protecting you against depression. And that is a complete paradigm shift. The idea that depression is something forced upon the brain by the brain itself is kind of a revolution in thinking. And it's something that we haven't completely incorporated into our theories of neuroscience yet, but hopefully we will. And in fact, we now know that CG25, suppression of CG25, is critical for recovery from depression, whether you use SSRIs or whether you use deep brain stimulation or ECT. Cognitive behavior therapy works somewhat differently. It works, as you might imagine, in the more cortical, the higher level of cognitive regions. And the GBS change actually is a little bit like the two together, and that's probably why it's more effective, because, of course, her patients hadn't all responded to SSRIs. And many different treatments suppress In fact, one of the reasons we did the psilocybin work in depression was because psilocybin itself also switches off this region, CG25. Even if you get better on placebo, CG25 goes down. So CG25 seems to be a brain region that is overactive and driving negative thoughts. And I think it's quite interesting because negative thoughts clearly got to come from somewhere. I mean, they don't just float in the brain. They've got to be elicited from somewhere, and that seems to be the best evidence of a region driving negativity we have. So why might that region be overactive? Well, the reason it's probably overactive is because it's not being suppressed adequately. And we know that there are two major inhibitory systems in the brain, the GABA system and the 5-HT1A receptor system. And there's a deficiency of 5-HT inhibitory receptors in the subgenual cingulate. And we know in depressed people from the work of Sargent and Grasby that this is a trait marker. Even when those depressed people recover, they still have a relative deficiency of 5-HT1A receptors, which is why they're vulnerable for the rest of their life. And what SSRIs are doing is increasing serotonin in the synapses here to offset the relative deficiency in those receptors. And so now you have a kind of a story which makes sense. SSRIs work because they put serotonin back where it's deficient. Many of the drugs we use work on the serotonin system. In fact, all but reboxetine and bupropion, they all have effects on the serotonin system. And in the new ones, like vortioxetine, do as well. So serotonin seems to be the best candidate for at least the mediation of aspect. Not all depression, clearly other. Dopamine could well be involved in hedonic tone, and noradrenaline more in drive. But probably negative cognitions somehow emerge from changes, dysfunction in the serotonin system. And the evidence of that has become very, very convincing in the last 20 years. Using this technique called tryptophan depletion, the 5-HT in your brain is critically dependent on the availability of the precursor tryptophan. Your brain doesn't really store more than a few hours worth of serotonin. So it's almost a real-time production of serotonin from tryptophan. And we know that because if we block the access of tryptophan to the brain by competing with the active transporter here with other amino acids, tryptophan levels in the brain fall, 5-HT levels in the brain fall, and over 5 hours you can produce profound changes in mood. And this is, I think, one of the seminal studies in the biology of psychiatry. This is from the group at Yale who took patients who recovered on SSRIs. They were euthymic. They depleted serotonin in their brain over 5 hours, and their mood collapsed over the 5 hours. Often with the depressive delusions returning. One of the subjects was a woman who had what used to be when I was training, it was quite common to have depressive delusions of the devil being on your back or being in your mind. We're less religious now, so we get less of those. But this woman had the depression, the devil on her back over here. She got better, the devil disappeared. They depleted tryptophan, serotonin in her brain, the devil came back. And then it went away again when they gave her enough protein to put the serotonin back. Now that's a hugely important study for two reasons. The first is it tells you don't get rid of depressive thinking. All that happens is you don't access it. It's there. I suppose it makes sense. If you've ever thought the devil's on your back, it's unlikely you're going to forget that. Why would you forget that? That's a pretty important thing to remember. But you don't access it. And this point I'm trying to make several times already is that what is happening in psychiatry is that people are switching from states where they've got an experience which is negative and maladaptive to a normal state. And that switch process is hardly studied, but it's critical because that's what drives illness or maintains illness. And if we can work out where it is and unswitch it, we could really make some progress. The other thing is, this also is very humbling because we used to be told that if people had mood swings that occurred over 5 hours, they were personality disordered. But when you can do it in the laboratory, then it has to be more than that, doesn't it? It has to be real, biological. It's not just acting out. And this is how I conceptualize serotonin in both anxiety and depression now, and I use this for my trainees and for my patients. I think the key role of serotonin is along the axis that psychologists call the axis of affective valence. And both depressed and anxious people have negative affective valence. They see the world as a hostile, nasty, unpleasant place, which of course it is. But that doesn't help you get better. In fact, that just stabilizes you in this rather depressed mood or anxious mood. You increase serotonin with an SSRI, say, or another antidepressant. Your affective valence switches to positive, just like where you are if you're a normal person. Tryptophan depletion drives down serotonin and puts you back where you were. So you can conceptualize all what I've shown you in terms of serotonin regulation of mood along this psychological construct of affective valence. And that's why I deliberately drew it like this, because this is a very powerful construct in psychology. But the other point to make, and this is one people don't understand as much, serotonin gives you resilience. Serotonin, you can show that in animals. If you increase serotonin, they become more resilient to stress, not just because they don't get depressed, but because the endocrine dysfunction of stress is also attenuated. So serotonin is a very protective anti-stress neurotransmitter. It even protects against cardiovascular stress. People are now using SSRIs to treat primary hypertension, which is like a psychological stress-induced hypertension. They're more effective than thiazides. Just a few. Let's move on a little bit. Anxiety disorders. There's Mr. Munch having his panic attack. We know that benzodiazepines are anxiolytic. We know now that anxiety disorder is associated with deficiency of the benzodiazepine system. Here we have 3 different studies. There's a study in PTSD, our study in panic, a study in generalized anxiety disorder, all using a different tracer to measure the density of these benzodiazepine GABA receptors. In panic disorder, a lot of the frontal regions of the brain show relative deficiency of the inhibitory neurotransmitter or inhibitory receptors. A similar kind of phenomenon that you see in epilepsy, where in focal epilepsy you see a deficiency of receptors. So in epilepsy there's an excess excitation because you've lost inhibition. And we argue that panic attacks could come for the same reason, that you haven't got adequate inhibition of the anxiety circuits. In GAD it's more a cognitive region. There's here the temporal pole. And in PTSD it's very much a medial prefrontal region. And this is a peculiarly interesting finding, the one in PTSD, because we've got very few MRI studies of panic disorder and very few MRI studies of GAD, but we've got hundreds of MRI studies of PTSD. And we know that if you put someone who's got PTSD in a scanner and they relive the PTSD, the region it's activated is this medial prefrontal region. This region is where you regulate access to your autobiographical memories. So there's a peculiar concordance of the neurochemical alteration that you see under PET and the neuro activity alteration that you see with MRI and PTSD, focusing it down on this particular brain region, which normally restrains memories, and in PTSD it can't restrain them. In our own panic study, we were able to show that areas of the brain which we know generate panic attacks, like the right orbitofrontal cortex, show a complete distinction between patients and controls. The highest binding in a patient was lower than the lowest binding in the controls. That kind of separation is almost unheard of in imaging. And it's almost diagnostic. You could argue that you could diagnose panic disorder by doing PET scans. It would be very expensive to do that, but it does help prove the point that this is a real functional finding. And in areas of the brain where we don't believe anxiety is mediated, there's no difference. So this abnormality seems to be related to the regions that are important. And I've already mentioned this. I just want to show you down here. In the panic study, they had 2 patients that panicked in the scanner, and they had the lowest level of receptors. So there's a bit of overlap there between the PTSD work and the panic disorder work of ours. Well, talking a little bit more about PTSD, because PTSD is a disorder of our century. We've got 40% of Rwandans. I would argue that certainly pretty much every Syrian has been exposed to trauma which could lead to PTSD. And it's a huge problem. In America, more soldiers kill themselves than are killed by the enemy. It's a kind of, some people would say it serves them right, but on the other hand, it is a kind of weird concept that now war is about something you do to yourself as well as destroying, of course, other people's countries. So what can we do about PTSD? Well, one of the most interesting developments in the last few years has been the resurrection of MDMA, or the development of MDMA as a therapy for PTSD. MDMA, of course, is misnamed as ecstasy when it became in the rave scene, but the Mitzhoffers have now done several studies looking at the efficacy of MDMA, 2 sessions of MDMA as a treatment for PTSD. And they use MDMA because MDMA allows people to cope with the memory of the trauma without dissociating. And here's their recent data showing that after the first MDMA session, there's a profound reduction in the CAPS score, which is this measure of PTSD, and it persists. And in fact, these are people with resistant PTSD. They failed 2 treatments, and they're staying well at the exit, and they're staying well for years afterwards. This is a transformative therapy. 2 sessions with a drug, and a lot of psychotherapy in those sessions, transforms them so that they stay well. Almost all of them, all but one of them, stayed well for up to 74 months. This is a remarkable discovery, and it really is. It was one of the reasons we're now doing an MDMA study in Bristol, but we're actually treating alcoholics who are drinking to suppress trauma. So their primary diagnosis is alcoholism, but their secondary diagnosis is PTSD, and we're seeing if we can actually take away the need for them to drink to suppress the memories by dealing with the PTSD in this kind of therapeutic session with MDMA. But how does it work? Well, over the years, I've given many drugs to people, but I was never managed to get any funding to study MDMA. When I went to MRC and the Wellcome Trust, they said, well, it's not a drug of addiction, so we don't study it. It's just a recreational drug. And I thought, well, if 1 million people a weekend are taking it, shouldn't we know what it does in the brain? They didn't want to know. In the end, I got it funded by a TV company. It was a remarkable program. Some of you may have seen it. It's the most watched science program in the history of Channel 4. And we did it. So we actually did the first proper brain imaging study of MDMA, paid for by Channel 4. And one of the things we dug out of this study was the fact that it does what we wanted it to do in terms of memory. These people are normal volunteers. They don't have PTSD. But even in those normal people, it suppressed, it reduced the negativity of negative memories, because we made them relive good memories and relive bad memories. And as you might expect, ecstasy increased the valence of good memories, but it decreased the valence of the negative memories. And that gave us some confidence that it might be working in the same way in PTSD. And in fact, the brain imaging studies were remarkable because they showed categorically that it would. The effect of MDMA is to suppress amygdala hippocampal activity and also to suppress prefrontal amygdala reactivity. So here you've got a biological underpinning of what is potentially going to be a revolutionary treatment for PTSD. And then finally, just a few words about brain networks, because modern neuroimaging has now allowed us to look at the brain not just as a series of separate regions, but as a network. We know there are probably 17 different networks in the brain. These are some of the more important ones. But the most important one for psychiatry is this one, the default mode. So here you've got the visual networks, medial lateral visual networks, the auditory network. And you're all using these at present. You're all using these, and he's using his sensory motor network because he's doing his phone. But that doesn't matter. That doesn't matter because he's actually taking a photo of me, and that's good. But the default mode network is the interesting one. The default mode network is a network that you only use when you're not doing things, and that's why it's called the default mode network. Now I'm going to activate the default mode network in all of you so you can experience it, right? So what I want you to do now, including you, Keith, including you, Wendy, you've got to put your phones down. So you're all going to close your eyes. Close your eyes, please all close your eyes, and then you're all going to think for about 30 seconds on what you're going to do tonight. Okay, so that process of introspection, planning, thinking about yourself, what your anticipations of activity tonight, that's all done in this region here, or this network called the default mode. And what's interesting about the default mode is it turns out that the default mode is abnormal in depression. So as you were doing your introspective thinking, you were activating brain regions which are the anterior cingulate, the posterior cingulate, and these lateral parietal regions. In people with depression, much more of the brain is engaged in the default mode network when they're not doing things. In fact, what coordinates this hyperactivity of the default mode is the subgenual cingulate, that region which is overactive. So this drives this overactivity. But the overactivity is particularly relevant because it correlates with rumination. The greater the connectivity of the default mode, the greater the amount of the default mode in depressed people, the greater they ruminate. And of course that's what depression is. Depression is a disorder of introspective rumination. Depressed people are thinking about themselves and their errors, their mistakes, their failures all the time. And the reason they're doing that is because that's what their brain is doing. And they can't disengage because they're being driven to do it by this region here, which is orchestrating it. So here we've now got an image of why depression is such a damaging disorder, because people are locked into thought processes. So the question is, can we break down that overactivity? And this is where our own research comes in. Completely coincidentally, we were studying the effects of psilocybin magic mushrooms on the brain because we were interested in why it made people hallucinate. But when we did that research, we discovered that one of the most profound and truly surprising discoveries, didn't expect this, was that the default mode, which is here, you can see here that these red areas, front and back regions, was completely disrupted by psilocybin. Actually, there is no default mode under psilocybin. Actually, that's why you hallucinate, because the default mode also regulates what you think and how you see. But we wondered, well, maybe this disruption of the default mode, maybe if you did that in people who were depressed, they'd stop being depressed. And to our surprise, we got a grant to do that. And we did it. And we did it not just because of our research. There's also been a little bit of work with John Hopkins showing that you can have enduring benefits from a single dose of psilocybin. And we modelled our study on theirs. We gave them the same dose, 25 milligrams of psilocybin, just like the Hopkins study. These were normal people who just wanted to feel better about life. Ours were depressed people. Started off with 12 subjects, treatment-resistant major depression, failed on at least 2 treatments. One person had failed on 9 drugs, all failed on CBT. And they did really well. At 1 week, half of them were recovered. And all of them were better. And then over time, some stayed well, some relapsed. But this is a profoundly powerful impact in resistant depression. There's no other treatment like it, even better than ECT. Now that study happened just because we saw the brain circuit of depression being disrupted in normal people. It was a hunch, but it worked. We also saw that it changes the way people think. Before the treatment, depressed people, as I said before, have what we call a negative affective valence. They have, another word for that is pessimism bias. They see the world as an unpleasant, nasty place, which keeps them depressed. The rest of us see the world as we're more optimistic. The depressed people, attitudes were normalised by treatment. And here's one of our patients. My outlook has changed significantly. I'm more aware now it's pointless to get wrapped up in endless negativity. I feel as I've seen a much clearer picture. In fact, based on that research, we've now come up with a 2-receptor theory of antidepressants. We believe that the SSRIs work in a completely different way to psychedelics. The SSRIs protect you against stress, and so you recover from depression and you're protected from relapse. The SSRIs disrupt depressive thinking and allow you to think more clearly about the world and have a much more positive attitude on the world. And if you want to read about this, there's a free download in the JPsychoFile. So we think we can approach depression now from 2 separate serotonergic directions. And just by the way, those of you who are psychotherapists, you change the brain too. This is a very nice study out of Finland showing that you can increase the density of serotonin 1A receptors following a course of psychotherapy depression. It's probably due to the fact that people are less stressed and less depressed. And so the receptors are going back to where they should be. And I think the future is going to be quite exciting. I think we're going to be using drugs like MDMA and psychedelics and maybe ketamine and maybe cannabinoids as psychotherapeutic tools to work with psychotherapists to maximize the ability of people to gain from the therapy, maybe to allow them even to engage in the first place. And I think this is going to be a very powerful new paradigm in psychiatry. Don't know what to call it. I don't know if it's drug-assisted psychotherapy or psychotherapy-assisted drug treatments, or I don't really care as long as we're together doing it. And I just want to finish with this quote from George Bernard Shaw, the great writer and philosopher. those who cannot change their minds cannot change anything. And I just hope that what I've shown you today gives you some inkling as to how research, brain research, can at least potentially change the future of psychiatry. I mean, it's going to be a challenge, but and I'm too old to do it, but hopefully some of you will take it up. Thank you very much.
Thank you.